You are listening to the 8th broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the TBR History Hour, hosted by Dr. Edward DeVries, TBR contributing editor. In today's show, Dr. Ed interviews Harald Scharnhorst. Harald discusses his articles on Cowboys and Vigilantes that appeared in the January-February issue of the Barnes Review.
Out of the night, when the full moon is bright, comes a horseman known as Zorro. This bold renegade carves a Z with his blade, a Z that stands for Zorro.
Whenever I think of Vigilantes and Vaqueros, I think of Zorro because he was both. And of course, that was one of my favorite TV shows when I was a kid, and I still watch the episodes from time to time. Believe it or not, I actually have them all on DVD. And so we decided that that was going to be our show opener today because our subject of conversation is Vaqueros and Vigilantes. The subject of our conversation, of course, being the two subjects that were written upon in the January-February issue of TBR magazine by TBR's own contributing editor, Harald Hesstvedt Scharnhorst. And so we're going to talk to Harald here about those two very interesting subjects.
How did somebody from Norway become fascinated with American cowboys?
I came to this country as a little boy and traveled the first time around from New Orleans going west on the old Route 66. When I got to Mexico and Arizona and saw all that beautiful country and all those busy Indian savages and cowboys and everything, my mind never been the same since.
So what was it then about Mexico that made you become fascinated with cowboys?
Well, it's an interesting story. It's like I've written in my book, An Immigrant Remembers. When we first came to America on a visit, I was 7 years old, and when we came here to settle as permanent residents, I was 9 years old. We had to kind of wait outside the country in order to get our permission to enter permanently. And so anyway, when I came here the first time around, we got off the ship in New Orleans, and we traveled west on the popular road known as Route 66. There was a TV show by the same name, as you may recall. In any case, I wasn't much interested in what I saw on the trip until I got to New Mexico and Arizona, the southern part, the southwest part of the United States. And oh my goodness, all those beautiful canyons, those red rocks and the trees and the Indians. Oh my goodness, I thought they were a bunch of savages and cowboys and what have you. And of course, this really interested me as a little boy. There's something about that just appeals to young men. And so I decided over time, after our first encounter with Indians at Gallup, New Mexico, in the trading post there, that I needed to know more about this. And so every chance I got, I would read books or I would read stories about the American Southwest. And eventually I expanded it to include all of the West. So many different peoples that have settled in the western part of the United States, including the Basques who came from the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal. The Mormons, for example, have made a terrific inroad into the West. And then there have been a number of other individuals, including the Scandinavians and so forth, who came to this part of the country. And then with the coming of the gold rush, people went insane. So all of these things were stories that interested me tremendously. There was a Southwest American author who wrote all kinds of books about rattlesnakes and this sort of thing. He was called J. Frank Dobie. Maybe you're familiar with him. One of the great American writers. And I read everything that he ever wrote. And he was one of these folksy guys that just knew how to get a point across, knew how to be a really good storyteller, and that appeals to me tremendously because I think that everything that I do is pretty much along the same line. I tend to be a storyteller. And then along came Arizona Highways in the 1960s and 70s, and there was an editor of that magazine whose name was Raymond Carlson. And Raymond was one of these kind of guys that not only solicited the best photographs he could for this magazine, which was the first of its kind, but he also included a lot of stories in the magazine that had to do with the American cowboy. throughout my lifetime, I've kind of had an interest in this sort of stuff. And when we did move to northern Idaho and northwest Montana, of course, that is cowboy country to some extent. It also resembles Norway to a great extent. So I've lived here now for the last 32 years and quite happy with it.
So you say that Montana resembles Norway. I've been to Montana a few times. I've never been to Norway. But for some reason, I can't imagine Montana resembling anywhere, let alone Norway.
Well, actually, it does. First of all, the eastern part of Montana is a high plain, and that doesn't resemble Norway at all. But the western part of Montana is very forested, has lots of high mountains, lots of rivers, and it's quite a bit like Norway.
Okay, maybe that's my problem. I've always been in the eastern part of Montana, in the Badlands, and over there. Was the connection was the resemblance to Norway what ultimately drew you to Montana, or how did you end up in Montana then?
Yeah, that was really the big story. And I've told that story also in my book. But yeah, we did end up there and had quite an adventure in northern Idaho back in the 1950s. And a couple of years ago, I did a story for the Barnes Review on the Bear Paw Massacre in eastern Montana, which had to do with the last major Indian war here in the American West. And that was quite an interesting story. I went back there to look the place over, talk to some of the Indians, and get some interview material, which I did, and that was eventually published. And that's a fascinating part of the world, And I've had opportunities to go down to the Nez Perce National Historical Park down in Lapwai in Idaho and talk to the rangers down there and to some of the Indians and about the conditions that they have. And it's really interesting to see what the National Park Service will do to preserve some of our history. Back east and in the south, they're trying to do everything they can to erase history, and out here we seem to be doing everything we can to cater to the Indians. So it's an interesting dichotomy.
So you had mentioned Mormons and their western migration. Is that a fascinating study for you just because you're interested in the western migrations, or is there something more personal with Mormonism with you?
Well, it's probably a little of both. We have quite a few Mormons in this area, and they're basically good people. Mormons don't always get along with all the other different religions, and the ones who don't like each other, they call each other names. And I kind of look away from that because all of these are Christian religions, and they all kind of worship the same Jesus Christ. So I try not to get too much involved in that. But the Mormons were kind of unique in the sense that they were a group of people that started out as kind of like a cult, and they ended up in a place called Nauvoo in Illinois. And that's where one of the temples was built. And Joseph Smith, who was the founding prophet of the church, he became a very powerful man that scared a lot of people. And so eventually the Mormons were forced out of there and ended up going west to Salt Lake City. And today Utah is pretty much a Mormon state. But anyway, Joseph was murdered by a vigilante group in Carthage, Illinois. The people were very worried and disturbed about the Mormons because actually the Mormons seemed to have more power than even the governor of the state of Illinois at the time. So there was a lot of panic, and there was also a lot of jealousy because the Mormons were an extremely clean and orderly bunch of people. If you know anything at all about the Mormon organization even today, it's amazing what those people come up with and what they can do. They're just organized that way, and if the rest of us were half as organized as they are, boy, we would really have something going. So anyway, the Mormons went west, and the poor ones had hand carts that they rolled all the way across the country, and the others would either ride horseback or they would use the covered wagons, just like so many other people did. And they have made quite an inroad into this area. And then, of course, you had the 49ers, the miners who came to California and came to many of the different states in the West. A really big impression. In San Francisco, for example, in 1949, there were some 400 or 500 ships that were anchored in the bay. And when the news of the gold strike at Sutter's Fort in the Sierra Nevada foothills in California came to pass, Why, everybody just up and left everything. The ships were left to rot and decay, and people would desert from the military, and it was just a chaos. Everybody was going to get rich overnight. So these are crazy things that have happened in the West, and the more you look into it, the more you read about it, and there's so much material available. It is an absolutely fascinating tribute to the spirit of man, good, bad, or indifferent.
And so then your fascination from Cowboys, or with Cowboys rather, it didn't come from watching all of those old cowboy shows on TV on Saturdays then?
Well, it did to some extent. You know, I was a Roy Rogers fan, and his real name was Leonard Sly. He was actually part Indian, and he was a very handsome and dashing fella. And, of course, there was all the others. There were so many of them. The Lone Ranger was a favorite, but they weren't television shows so much. They were radio shows at that time. And yes, you're right. A lot of that was in the motion pictures. And of course, I enjoy John Wayne as much as anybody else. He's quite an interesting man in so many ways, and one of the unusual people in Hollywood. He's not at all like the Hollywood crowd of today. He was actually a subscriber to American Free Press many years ago, what used to be known as the Spotlight. So there were a lot of characters like that I had an opportunity to either one meet or was just simply a fan of. So I enjoyed the whole milieu about that. But you know, there's a lot of misinformation that comes out of Hollywood about the American cowboy, and they don't realize that the American cowboy really was Spanish to start with. As far as the vigilantes were concerned, you know, once you had a huge influx of people that went into the gold fields of the West, you had people who were honest, and you had those that weren't. And then you had those that preyed on the miners, and then you had law people that came in there who were worse than the crooks. So into this whole mess, people were kind of thrown, and the law of the land was he who was fastest with the gun or the fist or the knife or whatever was the one that's going to come out on top. And eventually it created so much disorder that in the mining camps, it resulted in vigilantism.
Do you think that vigilantism was kind of a outgrowth of the lifestyle of the Old West, or?
I think it's an American phenomenon. There's a little sidebar article that we have on the Vigilante article in the Barnes Review this time around, in which I've pointed out that this developed for several reasons, the biggest of which was probably that there was so much disorder that order had to be established. And one of the best ways to do that, you know, is a form of terror. You take a look at the situation after the Civil War, you know, the North's war of aggression against the South, which a lot of Westerners referred to as the Great Unpleasantness. Kind of an interesting terminology. But at the end of the war, there was a lot of free Negroes that were roaming around. There were lots of people who had lost their houses and homes and really didn't really quite know what to do. And then the North, of course, did everything they could to put the Negro in places he really wasn't qualified for, and that was usually in government. And so this is one of the reasons for the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And very few people today really understand that. And it wasn't just the Klan that came about. There were other organizations as well, like in Virginia City, Montana, where this particular story that I've written here is actually situated. You will find that there was a lot of people of Southern persuasion who came there. And one of the committees was known as the Confederate Committee. I don't have a lot of information on that, but I found it fascinating to see that so many people from that part of the world ended up in the gold fields. So vigilantism has reared its ugly head in a lot of different ways, and sometimes innocent people were killed. There were Negro riots, for example, in Louisiana. There was the problems in Virginia City, Montana, also Virginia City, Nevada, which is a completely different entity, not to mention along the Sierra Nevada, the mountain range in California. And they all had the same problems. And at that time, we didn't have any internet, we didn't have telephone service, we didn't have means of quick communications, so it was possible for a guy who got into trouble in one area to go somewhere else. And people wouldn't find out about it until, you know, well after the fact. So vigilantism is pretty much an American phenomenon. It's a little bit different than guerrilla activity, although in some ways it's similar.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
The British were not the only people to colonize a country.
That's right.
And I guess you said the American peoples were not the first ones to, move across their continent and explore and settle into previously uncharted territory. But yet the peoples of Europe or the peoples of Asia, the peoples of Africa, peoples of South America, they didn't develop this vigilante system of justice like we did in the United States. Why do you think that was?
Well, that's hard to tell, but the only similarity that I can think of between the development of the American West and other countries was South Africa. The Battle of Blood River, for example, and the covered wagon syndrome there. And you may also have seen a little of that in Australia as well, where there's a definite motion picture industry that has to do with cowboyism. So there's probably a little bit of it there too. But I think on a grand scale, America takes the cake.
But what is the reason for that? Do you think there's a particular reason why that happened?
It's like a fellow said to me one time, in the beginning there was only one law. Don't encroach. And it makes a lot of sense, because if you encroach on another man's territory, he's not going to like you. And if you encroach on his territory too much, he's probably going to kill you. So it really becomes kind of a defensive mechanism. And in the West, in the American West, there was a certain set of circumstances that developed that just nurtured that. And then, of course, you had the need for weapons and guns and things of that nature, although guns weren't always the weapon of choice. Sometimes it was knives and sticks and stones. I think really the encroachment thing was the big deal. If you had something that belonged to you and it was yours and you worked for it, by golly, you were going to defend it. And if somebody tried to take that away from you, you were going to defend it to the death. So this was probably one of the things that really led to it, at least in my judgment.
The Old West, and this is probably as much from Hollywood as it is from anywhere else. Of course, you walk into the saloon, somebody looks at you funny, you pull out your 6-shooter and you drop him. For some reason, something tells me that kind of stuff probably never really happened except for in the movies.
That's correct. It's a myth. I mean, let's say that it did happen, but it wasn't something every day. But in Virginia City, that I've written about in this particular article, in Virginia City, Montana, there we had a unique situation because the miners came in there and a few Mormons came in there, and they were orderly people. And a lot of them simply settled as farmers. And, when farmers get together, ranchers get together, they are trying to wrest a living out of a land that is very inhospitable. They've got to build their first houses. They've got to build their first little roads, primitive as they are. And the result is that these people are hardworking individuals and honest, and they don't have time to go into bars and go shoot them up. So that doesn't follow at all. But what happened is when gold was discovered, all of a sudden people come in by the scads, have no discipline, no respect for other people's property, and you have maximum encroachment. And this is kind of what developed in Virginia City, Montana. And eventually it got to be so bad that the citizens there, the so-called leading citizens, many of whom were Confederate people, they decided that they're going to have some quiet meetings and decide to hire a sheriff. And the guy they hired turned out to be a bigger crook than the crooks themselves. And by the time he got through, he had organized such a gang of crooks, and so many people were killed, one right after another. I think the total was somewhere around 125, that the city decided, hey, we need to get rid of these people, and we need to get rid of them fast.
Well, there's an article that I have been wanting to write for years, and every time I try to get it onto paper, it just it just escapes me. For whatever reason, I don't like the final product, and I wind up destroying it to start again, sometime later. And the gist of the article would be basically the history of the Highwayman. And the conclusion of the article would be that your state police, your state troopers, and so forth are basically modern day highwaymen. That is those correct. Who were supposed to protect us from the Highwayman became the Highwayman, and that's kind of what you wrote in your article on Vigilantism.
Absolutely, this is what happened. With that happening today too, I can tell you there are lots of counties up in this area here that have sheriffs who are involved in all kinds of interesting things. You probably have the same problem in the South. But they're quiet, orderly, and they don't cause any problems. If you don't cause any problems for them, they don't cause any problems for you. And back in the 1870s and so forth, or even the 1850s, at the conclusion of the unpleasant, he described the Civil War, that was a whole different thing. So, yeah, a lot of these people were shakedown artists. Every time a cop stops somebody, the first thing I think of is, well, there goes another revenue enhancement job. That's basically what it's nothing to do with becoming a safer driver or anything of that nature. So yeah, you're right. They are the highwaymen, and that's something that police don't always like to hear. But I have a lot of ex-police officers who are friends of mine, and they basically kind of smile a little bit and will agree with you that yeah, many times that's the case. Although some of those men were from an era where cops were perhaps halfway decent, and I would back them at any point. And even here in the local area, it's a common thing for us locals to back the sheriff. Just a real quick example, I came upon a car that was sideways in the road one day because it had the guy had overcorrected and ended up flipping over, and the sheriff himself was there. I stopped and asked if I could be of service, and he said, well, sure, yeah, go direct traffic. So I did until the state cop showed up. And then I helped him right the vehicle and get it off the road. So we have kind of a citizen participation thing that exists in a lot of these rural counties. And we're not to help out the sheriff. We don't accuse him of always being a highwayman, but a lot of them in their own way can be. So under those circumstances, he knows who I am, I know who he is, and we get along fine.
Of course, you're talking about how a lot of times then they would hire a sheriff or they would, bring in a marshal or somebody, and the person who was supposed to enforce the law is, like I said, as big of a crook as the people who they were trying to correct. Do you think that those sheriffs and then came in or were brought in when the Vigilantism failed, or do you think that the Vigilantism was the response of the conventional law enforcement not working?
Well, it was a response to non-law at all. There was no law in the Montana Territory, Idaho, Montana Territory back in the days of Virginia City. There just wasn't any. So everybody kind of depended upon the handshake. It was a common thing amongst people. If you made an agreement, let's say you went to buy a mule, you bought the mule either sight unseen, based on reputation, and a handshake. Sometimes if people didn't have the gold dust, didn't have money in those days, so it was gold dust that was the medium of exchange. And it was common for people to say, okay, well, I will be digging gold out of the ground, and I expect to have so much based on my past performance, and I'll pay you in a month or in 2 weeks or whatever. So the handshake was the basis of much that went on. So when you get into situations where people are crooked, no matter who they are, all of a sudden that equilibrium is disturbed and destroyed. And the more of it you have happen, the more likelihood is that you have a need for a strong lawman. And so that's how that gets started. And as long as the law behaves in a manner that people are willing to put up with, there's really no issue. But if it ever gets to a point where people get the idea that it's completely out of control, then you're going to see vigilantism rise again. And this is what I find so interesting, the Virginia City thing, as well as what goes on in today's environment. Take a look at Virginia right now over the so-called gun seizure thing. I mean, there's an example where people are just standing up and saying, hey, we don't want any of this stuff.
Well, Paul Angel was telling me that one of the things that's actually making that situation tenable, if you will, is the fact that the sheriffs themselves are rising up and saying that, hey, you know what, we're the law enforcement leaders, here in our respective counties, and we're not going to allow these laws to be enforced.
Well, this is wonderful. I mean, that's the kind of sheriff you want. Those are the kind of people you want to help them in any possible way you can. In the Old West, the sheriffs used to deputize cowboys and others to go looking for a bad man. And that's the same thing that's happening here. What the sheriff is basically doing without making it a formal thing, he's deputizing people.
You know, you watch the old Western shows. You know, again, we've already established that you know, the reality of the Old West and the old Western shows aren't synonymous. But you watch the old Western shows, and you had two depictions of a sheriff. One of them was, you know, as you said, the sheriff was a bigger crook than the crooks he was supposed to go after. Or the other one was the sheriff was absolutely worthless. And he was, you know, some little sniveling, cowardly, you know, whatever. You know, were there some sheriffs that were somewhere in the middle and actually doing their jobs, or were those two extremes the reality of the Old West?
Absolutely, Ed. You find all kinds of people. You know, in your own experience with people in daily life, you find that to be the case. You find people who are in denial. You find people who are cowards. You find people who are very aggressive. You find some who go along to get along. I mean, you name it and you will find it. So amongst the sheriffs, yes, there were some of those. And they usually either didn't last or they were so ineffective that people just kind of did what they wanted to anyway.
Do you remember the TV show with Johnny Yuma, the rebel?
Yeah, vaguely.
I was going to say, you know, there's a guy who, you know, when the sheriff wasn't getting the job done, he kind of took the law into his own hands. I was going to ask, is that how you would describe typical vigilantism or no?
Yeah, I think that is very similar. You know, there's an example. Charles Brosnan was involved in a movie, starred in a movie that had to do with a guy who decided to clean up the streets of a town, and he did so in a very unsavory sort of way, and the cops kind of didn't like him, but at the same time they kind of looked the other way. I don't remember the name of the movie, but it was quite an interesting show. And again, it's based on this business of vigilantism. You take a look today, for example, at Chicago. If there ever was a place, and I'm not advocating this, but if there ever was a place where vigilantism could rear its ugly head, it would be in a place like Chicago. And I guarantee you that in short time, they would clean house.
They used to call Cook County, Illinois, where Chicago is, Crook County, Illinois. And the government of Chicago and the government of Cook County were so corrupt that actually the Capone mob originally rose up to clean things up. And the mafia was cleaner than the cops and the politicians, and the people supported the mafia. That's how Capone got his power.
Yes, it's crazy, but unless you sit down and really analyze, like you're doing now and I'm doing now, sit down and analyze the motivations behind all this, it's impossible to understand anything. And in today's environment, we have way too many people that are either pro or con something, and they don't stop to consider why things develop. And what you're pointing out is absolutely true.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
Remember the TV show Bonanza?
Yes. Oh, yeah. One of my favorites.
The Cartwrights. That was one of my favorites as a show growing up as well. Was that a pretty good depiction of of life on the West? And you had a family that pretty much was law abiding and they supported the authority around them, but yet there were some episodes where they kind of were the authority around them out of necessity, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. You're correct. The only thing about that show that wasn't particularly accurate was there was no woman in the family. And that was an unusual situation. The fact that a man would raise three boys on his own was not something that was common in the West. If a wife died, a man usually took another wife very quickly, and it was because it was absolutely necessary. Women were kind of interesting in Virginia City. I'd written a little bit about this, and it's not in the article very much, but there were very few women in Virginia City. And women were just not necessarily welcome in the rawest part of the West because they were regarded as more delicate creatures, and whereas men tended to be more rough and tumble and dirty and all this sort of stuff. So when women actually started coming into places like that, they were kind of revered and looked upon as goddesses. The thing that women did for the West was civilize the West. That was the positive aspect of it. On the other hand, women have a tendency to be very nurturing, and sometimes they nurture the wrong people. At Virginia City, that caused a problem because a guy who shot someone point blank, who was a nice-looking, sweet little boy of 22, was up for hanging. And the women all wailed and whined, "Oh, you can't kill him, he's so beautiful." And never mind the fact that the guy he shot point blank is laying dead in the barn next door. And so the men got together and they said, "Hey, this is not a woman's place. You go back to your pots and pans and don't interfere in the affairs of men." So they hung him, and they hung a whole bunch more. Can you imagine what would have happened if the liberal element had prevailed? There wouldn't have been any hangings, and the vigilante activity would have been useless, and the sheriff would have prevailed, and the crooks would have prevailed. This is the kind of thinking that people just aren't very capable of understanding.
And so the vigilante justice, if you will, did it extend to the point then, you talked about how justice was very swift. Were the vigilantes,
Yes.
Did they, in most situations, were they judge, jury, and executioner? Or do you think that more often or not they did turn these people over for trials?
Like in some cases, when they actually went on the road to pursue these guys that had run away, there were several rules of conduct. One was absolutely no alcohol. A member of the vigilantes would have in possession any alcohol. He was not to use it during the time that he was on the road. And when he was pursuing, or even if he did act as judge, jury, and executioner, and they usually went 2 or 3 at a crack, that sort of stuff was prohibited. And the purpose in that was to make sure that it was sober, that it wasn't a wild mob engaging in useless activity, but rather was a very sober thing. So if they did chase after someone, which they did during that very cold winter, they would catch up with these people, and there was a trial held on the spot, and the guy either confessed, which he often did. In fact, all of them confessed.
Said you say that they all confessed, like they were coerced to confess, or they had no other option but confession.
You could say they coerced to confess. In looking at Thomas Dimsdale's writings, the guy that I based this article on, he was editor of the Montana Post, and was a chronicler of people. And no, his basic attitude is that this was a sober operation. I don't think they had to twist anybody's arm to get a confession, because usually they'd find evidence on the person that proved that he was guilty. When that was the case, and then he did confess and all that sort of stuff, then they just found the nearest tree and they hung him. And some of them, for example, would say things like, "Well, I don't mind dying as long as so-and-so gets what he's got coming, because he's just as guilty as I am." This kind of situation. So was there any impropriety there? Well, the odds say that there could have been. But I would tell you this, that the ones they hung were as guilty as sin.
When we think of vigilantism, we think of, singular characters more often than not. Batman, a singular character. Or, you think of the Old West and you think of vigilantism and you think of, a singular character. And, for example, Matt Dillon, of course, he wasn't a vigilante. He was a U.S. Marshal in the TV show. But, he was a single character who, kind of becomes the singular embodiment of the law or whatever. But you're saying that vigilantism very seldom, if ever, was the Zorro, for example. We're talking about the Old West in California. Zorro might be the perfect example of the cowboy, vaquero vigilante, if you will. You're saying that vigilantism was almost always a group effort.
Well, in this particular instance, it was. And I think in the mining camps, yes, it was definitely that. And the participated were known by numbers and not by name. So no one really knew who they were, which created a form of terror against the terrorists. It's kind of point and counterpoint. So that way messages would be sent from one to another so they wouldn't be intercepted. They would say, well, this is message for number 34, and this message is for number 12, and so on. And the numbers depended on the rank in the organization. So yeah, there were individuals like the ones you explained. They're like Batman and of course Matt Dillon and a number of these characters were individuals. They were definitely individuals who operated within the law or outside of the law. But the vigilante stuff that took place in the mining camps and things like that were primarily a group effort, because there was no one there to take care of the problem. And the people that had the most to lose, the business people, the ones who had mines and who had wives and families and stuff like that, or shops or whatever, they were the ones that had the most to lose, and they were the ones most likely to want to take care of this and develop law and order. And after this was all over, Virginia City became a very nice place. That's the funny part about it.
You had mentioned that these miners, and I'm sure that they worked long days. I'm sure that they got up early in the morning, and I'm sure they worked till late at night. And you said that in the course of a typical month that they would extract about an ounce of gold dust. I mean,
some of them more than
not even an ounce in nuggets, but an ounce of dust. I mean, that's a lot of work for an ounce of dust.
So an ounce of dust, let's say it was $20 or $30. And $20 or $30 back then was a lot of money. Just like when I was young, gas was like 70, 80, 90 cents a gallon. And so the difference in prices and value is different from then to now. But yeah, let's say that a guy was very fortunate and he extracted 4 or 5 ounces or more. He was a rich man. And of course, everybody knew about it because everybody bragged about it and talked about it. And when this sort of stuff was moved around from one place to another or sent to a refiner, let's say in Salt Lake, naturally everybody knew about this. So all the bad guys had to do was just sit around the bars and listen to people brag and talk, and pretty soon people set themselves up that way.
So tell me about George Ives.
George Ives. Ah, yes, what a sweetheart he was. It's funny about people like that. These men who became really bad guys were not bad people per se. They started out as pretty good guys. George was one of those people who behaved himself for the most part, and then he got into a situation where he ended up stealing some mules, and that was in Walla Walla, Washington. He discovered that, hey, it's easier than working for a living. And sometimes there are people who have a weak moment like that and decide to become what we call bad men. And he was one of those. So he kind of got what he had coming, in a manner of speaking, but originally he was a good guy. And some of these men were like that. Others had a penchant for violence. Once the first hanging took place in Virginia City, Montana, the news spread around the gold camps throughout the West in days. You wouldn't think that news would travel that fast, but bad news really travels fast. And even if it went on horseback, once it became known that they actually hung somebody, there were a lot of people that put their hands around their throats and go, uh-oh, I hope that's not going to be me next. And so you had this kind of a trickle-down effect.
And so he was executed. He was hung in 1863. So is he somebody who should have been off to war and had he just been doing what he should have been done, never would have gotten into trouble?
Well, I would say that's probably a good guess. He didn't go off to war. There were a number of people on the West Coast who actually got word from their regiments and stuff back in the South and elsewhere about the war, and so they went back. But there were some that didn't, and then there were deserters that went west too. You have to remember there were deserters probably on both sides, and they came west. They wanted to avoid that whole unpleasantness because they didn't agree with any of it. They didn't like Lincoln's forcing people into war, and they likewise didn't necessarily support the Southerners. So you had a lot of different people with different ideas, and many of them ended up in Virginia City, Montana. And they ended up in other places like Helena, which became the eventual state capital. But Virginia City was the territorial capital for a while. And then nearby there was a another place called Bannock, which also served as a territorial capital for a while. And but they lost importance after a while. And that's just how it goes.
So you talk about a lot of people were going out west to avoid the war. Tell me about the people who went out west after the war. A lot of those old Confederates, I say old, they weren't old, they were still young men, a lot of them. But tell me about some of them guys that went west, after the war.
They went west after the war to seek their own fortunes. And a lot of them that actually went did so because they came back home and discovered things in such a state. They said honey to the wife and took the children along and went west. There were many of those. They went to Texas, a lot of them. And then some of them became cowboys, and some became Army scouts and Army people. And some actually went to as far west as San Francisco, or even as far north as what is now Seattle. And they ended up farming and became good farmers. And some of them became important people in their own right. So this constant westward migration after the Civil War was full of all kinds of interesting activities. If you will look up on the internet, for example, information on the Oregon Trail, you'll find that there was a surprising number of women who chronicled on the trails. The Mormons are really good at that. They're very good at doing genealogy. They have their own religious reasons for doing that, but they're very chroniclers. And while women generally don't write historical novels, they nevertheless kept diaries. And these diaries are still available, and we can look at them and see what life was like. And what they would do is they would send a letter back to their old folks that they knew, or a cousin or aunt or uncle back in the East. And they would say, well, this is what happened today, and they would detail in quite graphic language what it was that took place, whether they had an encounter with Indians or blizzards or fires or whatever it might have been. And also their successes. And sometimes these people would never see their relatives again, simply because of the effect of time and distance. So these people became the life and the hardcore good folks that settled the West. And when I say good folks, I mean they were hardworking people, and they helped build this wonderful land of ours.
You talk about journals and chronicling and so forth. In your article, The Diary of an American Cowboy, and you said that you took your inspiration for the article from a Andy Adams book, The Log of a Cowboy. Was The Log of a Cowboy actually the Diary of a Cowboy, or was it a fictional rendering that was intended to read like the Diary of a Cowboy? Tell me about The Log of a Cowboy a little bit.
Well, it's possible that you're right about that. The fellow that wrote that book, he was a cowboy himself. And instead of writing it in the first person, he chose to write about others. There are some people like that. Instead of saying I, it becomes he. I went through that too. One time somebody said to me, why do you always say I? And I got to thinking about that. And so I end up sometimes saying we. And people say, who is we? So I would kind of characterize his authorship as that. Well, so he talked about a young man of 16.
I'll say my pet peeve is writers who refer to themselves in the third person. And so I generally do not do it. And I don't know how many times in submitting articles to the Barnes Review, the American Free Press, and other publications, the editors will change my first person references to third person.
Yep, they do that. This is the what we call the right of an editor to do as he pleases.
Yes.
And it's the bane of every writer is rewrites. I don't like them. You don't like them. Nobody likes them. But this is what they do, and they have their own reasons for doing that, and are not sinister by any stretch of the imagination. It's the way it is. If you look at Reader's Digest, that's a classic example of the ultimate rewrite. Every single article, condensed book, whatever it is, that appears in Reader's Digest all sound the same. And they do because they have editors who put everything in a certain format, and no matter which article you read, it sounds like it was written by Joe Blow. And unless it's a very unusual subject, and I mean really an unusual subject that requires specific terms like nautical terms and things of that nature, most of the time everything they write sounds the same. Now that's not a feature in the Barnes Review. We have a lot of individuals, like I have my style, you have yours, and we don't do anything to change that necessarily. But there's always a certain amount of rewriting that's required, and especially when it comes down to trying to fit everything in so many pages. When I write, I try to make it as concise as I can, because I try to get as much material in my articles as I possibly can. And oftentimes than I can fit in. So I have to really be careful how I word things, and I tend to take, for example, a whole page and reduce it to 2 sentences. And that requires some thought processes to be accurate.
Hello, I'm Tom Strain, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Confederate flag, Confederate symbols, and the reputation of our Confederate ancestors has come under attack. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is actively fending off our detractors, but there is only so much that we can do. We need your help. Contact your local, state, and national elected politicians and tell them that you will not tolerate these attacks on our heritage. You can also visit scv.org, download an application to join us in our fight to preserve our Southern heritage. Visit scv.org today. If you don't have a Confederate ancestor and you are tired of American history disappearing, you can assist us by becoming a friend of the SCV. Please visit scvheritagedefense.org and make a donation to the Heritage Defense Fund. We hope that you will join us in the fight to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name.
So anyways, I'm sorry to have interrupted you there, but you were telling me how Andy Adams chose to basically, perhaps write his diary for publication as though it were the diary of someone else.
Well, it's possible, but when it says a diary of a cowboy, it means that. It's really the diary of young Moore, the cowboy. So he's writing about a friend of his. So it's not like he's about himself, but when he wrote that book, you have to remember, he has cowboy experience, so he knows exactly how to word things. It's just like I will say certain things in a certain way because I have familiarity with it. And I was reading a book here the other day that was fiction, for example. The person who wrote it obviously had done a lot of research, but they made a couple of statements in there that are absolutely impossible because they run contrary to circumstances. But they don't know that. And so this is why people who don't understand a certain subject sometimes will reveal themselves when in reality it's just simply they don't know. Whereas in the case of the log of a cowboy, here's a guy who understood cowboyism very well. And he was very comfortable writing about it. And when he writes about Tommy Moore and his friends, he writes from a position of strong knowledge. So I don't necessarily look upon it as either plagiarism or as trying to hide anything. I think he just wrote a book that was interesting. And it is. I've read it several times. And every once in a while when I have a little time and I have nothing else going on, I'll dig out some of these old books and read them again. Nothing new out of them. And the one thing that amazes me about many of these writers, Ed, is the fact that they're so familiar with their subjects that it's very easy just to drop right into it. If you're a fan of some of the Western writers, for example, Louis L'Amour, has been almost everywhere that he writes about. And even though he writes fiction, he writes it with that wonderful flavor that says, I know all about this. I was there once. I saw. I did. And so his stories ring true. Same thing with the Log of a Cowboy. I just found that the book was really great, and it was full of tragedy and hope. And above and beyond all, it showed the ability of young people, 62, to take on the job of a full-blown man with lots of experience. And I know a few young people today in my immediate society who are like that. And it's wonderful to read. We hear all these stories about druggies and how young people are a problem and all this kind of stuff. But I'll tell you what, back in those days, and even today, young people are worthy of both praise and consideration.
So you talk about that. We were talking about John Wayne earlier, and of course John Wayne, he was, he made movies where, he was this old guy and he's on the cattle drive or whatever. Do you really think that that an older man like that could have done the things that John Wayne did in the movies, or was that very much a young man's job?
Well, it was you have to remember that the Cowboys were were basically different from the California Vaqueros. And the Cowboys kind of developed their own style in the Plains area to suit the circumstances. A lot of them were Mexicans, and an awful lot of them were free blacks who had been freed after the war between the states. The unpleasantness was over. So you had a different variety of people there. Many of them were young people. However, oftentimes the ones who were the leaders were the older ones. And yet there were times, as was indicated in the book there was a time when a young man of 20 was a trail boss in charge of 3,000 cattle, driving them north from Texas all the way up into Abilene, Kansas. And they ran into a situation trying to get these cattle across the river. And this guy, whose name was Slaughter, had experience in building bridges, makeshift bridges across streams that were a problem. And he was so good at it that even the older men who were in charge of their own trail drives would defer to his judgment. So I think it was a matter of, and I'm kind of the same opinion, that it really doesn't matter whether you're 16 or 61, are you man enough to do the job? Do you know what you're doing? And who should I listen to, you or me? If you have more experience than I have, then I'm going to defer to you. And that's the kind of stuff we don't see a lot of in today's environment, except maybe in the military. And personally, I'd like to see more of that.
So you talk about these long herds of cattle. In your article, you said sometimes they were driving a herd of cattle that was as long as 3 miles long. And, in other words, it wasn't just moving a couple dozen cows. It was hundreds and thousands of cows, and they were several miles long.
Yeah, they could be 3,000 head would not be unusual. That would be very typical. But you have to remember the bovine mentality. Okay, bovines are some of the stupidest creatures on earth, and they play the herd mentality. It's the game of follow the leader. So the trick is you have a lead steer, or maybe one that isn't neutered, and he's the one that the Cowboys will kind of supervise and watch, and everybody follows the leader. And as long as things are normal, you don't have a bunch of Indians attacking, or you don't have a thunderstorm, or you don't have something unusual, these animals are pretty much orderly. And there's like maybe 15 cowboys supervising them. And the only time they really run into troubles is when something unusual happens. And then it would be a problem. I'll give you one idea of just how intricate the business of what I call bovine mentality is. Slaughter, in trying to get the cattle across the river, managed to get several different outfits cattle across the river. But when it came to the one that Tommy Moore was running, the cattle absolutely refused to go across that rickety bridge. They tried everything from firing guns to pushing them to running them to get them to go across that bridge, and these stupid creatures would not go. So one guy who was smarter than the rest came up with an idea. He noticed that there was a calf out there. So the first thing he did was lasso the calf and brutally drag it across the bridge. And the mother, of course, a typical female, she goes nuts. And so she's bawling her head off, and the steers who normally protect the cows are all upset. And she finally decides to go across the bridge. She forgets that it's something that a little while ago she wouldn't do. And so she gets across, the steer go across, and pretty soon the whole herd goes.
And so you're saying then that cows are even more, I guess you could say, stupid than sheep.
I would have to agree with that. Sheep can be herded, usually with dogs. Now, what's interesting is they didn't use a lot of dogs to herd cows. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's a traditional thing. I don't really have an answer for that. But I noticed that in sheep, the sheepdogs are a very common, very popular means. And boy, those sheepdogs are smart. You just point at the sheepdog or point at the sheep, and the dog knows what to do. I'm not sure that works well with cows. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I really don't know enough to be able to say.
So you had mentioned that the cowboy was very different from the vaquero. How was that?
Oh, completely. Well, in the first place, you have to remember that Spain owned California in the beginning. And the only time that Spain gave up all of that was when Spain was at war and couldn't afford it. Then she gave it up to the Mexicans, who also had the same problem, and pretty soon part of Mexico became American. So the vaquero came about in the beginning. They were Spanish dons who were kind of like kings, who owned large areas of land that was given to them by the King of Spain. They were called haciendas. They were called land grants. And some of these guys became so wealthy and so rich that it was incredible. Originally, it was the padres, the missionaries who ran the missions along the coast of California, who actually started the cattle business. And they didn't start them for purposes of beef. They started them for the purposes of making tallow, which was the electricity of the time, because tallow was used to make candles. And candles, of course, was how people lit up their houses at night. So eventually the hacienda owners became very jealous of the padres and said, hey, this is a business you shouldn't be running. You should be doing religious work, and we're going to take this from you, and we'll run cattle from now on. So eventually they sold hides, they sold tallow, and then at some point down beef. And especially when you had the gold fields that were demanding food, and that was one of the things that came about. Now, these vaqueros were dressed impeccably. They had fancy leather. They had fancy leather saddles. Everything about them was fancy. If you look at some of the pictures, especially the one in the article there, you'll see that they were elegant people. Whereas the Plains was a very plain, no pun intended, was a very plain fellow. He was nothing more than a glorified laborer. And he had long days in the saddle, worked his ass off, literally, and for $25 a month, which was one gold piece. So looking at it today's rate, you could say they were paid somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 a month, just to use that as a comparison. And these guys out of that had to buy their own horse if they wanted to, or if they wanted the saddle, had to as well. Some of them saved their money. Some of them just kind of dissipated their money and had nothing. And they were sometimes a problem. So there's quite a bit of difference between the Spanish and the Cowboys of the Plains. Plus, you have to remember the Spanish were primarily that. They were primarily from Spain, so they were kind of one ethnic group, whereas the ones on the plain consisted of blacks and Mexicans and white people and sometimes foreigners, too. There were foreigners that came to this country and became American cowboys.
Harold, we are out of time, but what I want to do is I want to hold you over, and I want us to finish this conversation, and I want us to finish it on my TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. Of course, you were a guest on that show here about a year and a half or so ago now, 2 years ago maybe. I don't remember exactly when, but I do remember interviewing you on that show, and got a lot of positive feedback from several of our listeners and several of our Dixie Heritage subscribers, many of whom, of course, I know have also purchased your great book, An Immigrant Remembers, that is subsequently advertised every week on our Dixie Heritage newsletter. So I'd like to encourage you, our listener, to go over to the TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Show. Listen to the remainder of this conversation. If you don't know how to do that and you're online, simply, once you've clicked like and subscribe, you can click on our channel here on YouTube if you're a YouTube listener, and you can find that there in the show list, or you can go to www.barnesreview.org, click on the radio tab, and you'll see the Dixie Heritage Show link of the continuation of this interview with Harald Scharnhorst. Anyways, I do hope that you will go to that Barnes Review website, because in addition to the radio tab link, there's a lot of great information there, some great books you can download and read. You can get back issues of the magazine. If you're not already a subscriber to TBR Magazine, you can become a subscriber. And I'd also like to encourage you to go to the bookstore and look up Harold's book, An Immigrant Remembers. If you're not already someone who owns and or has read that book, you'll be glad that you did. And do one last thing for me, please. Go to www.dixieheritage.net, www.dixieheritage.net. And when you do, I will give you a free copy of my book, the truth about the Confederate battle flag. And you can also sign up for my weekly email newsletter. So next week, Lord willing, our guest will be once again Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Kennedy, military historian, and we will be discussing, if my memory serves, the Battle of Chickamauga. So until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents Today, God bless, and I'll be with you again next week.